Don't mind me, I'm just on the hunt for a rare species, the PAL exclusive. I've tracked one all the way out here to the Birmingham Zoo, and I'm not letting it get away. We're close. There it is! Damn it, son of a bitch! It doesn't even work in my Wii. We live in a world divided. Divided by oceans, by borders, by religion, and by our ability to play 10,000 bullets on the PS2. Those sons of bitches have had it too good for too long. Region locking, making sure that your product or service can only be used in a specific region. It happens with everything. Movies, websites, phones, even printers are region locked. Ay caramba! Of course, video games also have a history of region locking, and looking back at some of the older consoles, there were some clever methods used to accomplish these locks, and even cleverer methods to beat them. The NES was the first game console to introduce region locking and went as far as to not only include a lockout chip that would prevent other regions' games from running, but they also completely redesigned the console for the worldwide release so you couldn't physically fit Japanese games into an international console or vice versa. Geez, North America, are you compensating for something? On top of being physically larger, the international cartridges also had a different number of pins, meaning that even if you could wrestle a Famicom card into an NES, it still just wouldn't work. That said, Nintendo themselves technically released an adapter that would allow Famicom cards to work. It's not entirely clear why, but for some reason, Nintendo had trouble producing enough of the 72-pin NES boards to meet demand early on. Their solution was to make an adapter to convert the 60-pin Famicom boards to 72 pins and cram them both into an NES cartridge. Since the quote-unquote key to the lockout chip was on the adapter itself, these could be used to bypass region locking entirely to play Japanese Famicom games on North American or European consoles, as long as you're willing to do a little disassembly. These, as well as third-party products like the Game Genie, would allow you to relatively easily bypass region locking, and then the revised top-loader NES didn't include region locking at all, though Famicom cards still wouldn't work without an adapter. Moving over to the competition, the Sega Master System was a direct competitor to the NES and Sega's first console to release outside of Japan.
Find the miracle ball.
I wonder why no one gives a shit about this one. Similar to the NES, the cartridges for the international systems had a different shape and pinout than the Japanese cards, meaning Japanese games, again, wouldn't fit and wouldn't work even if they did. Unlike the NES, however, there was also a BIOS chip on the console itself that would prevent Japanese games from running even if an adapter was used. The Master System did have another slot for Sega cards, much smaller cartridges which were identical in all regions. Removing the BIOS chip would allow you to play these regardless of which region they were from, giving you unrestricted access to a whopping library of 40 mostly shit games. Great. Moving up a generation, Sega's Mega Drive and Genesis cartridges had identical pinouts in all regions, and you might think that would mean region compatibility was pretty simple. It says here you're a dumbass. So initially most Genesis games were technically region-free, but Japanese cartridges had a different design that, say it with me folks, wouldn't fit in international consoles. Yeah, we've seen this already. Japanese cartridges also had a little slot which a plastic tab in the console would slide into when the power switch was turned on, meaning that if you stuck a North American card into a Japanese console, you wouldn't even be able to turn the power on. That would have been easy enough to bypass with a few modifications, but then Sega went and revised the console design in 1991 to add in their trademark security system, or TMSS. The main purpose of this redesign was to enforce Sega's new licensing requirements, similar to Nintendo's, but it was also used to enable a software region lock on pretty much all Genesis and Mega Drive games going forward. If that wasn't complicated enough, EA, yeah, the pride and accomplishment guys, threw another wrench into the soup of software compatibility and trademark licensing. This metaphor is getting out of hand. So EA, the guys who killed Westwood Studios, tried to negotiate a better licensing deal, but Sega refused to budge, and at one point dared them to just reverse engineer the Genesis and make their own cartridges if they wanted a better deal. So EA called their bluff and figured out how to manufacture their own Genesis carts, which is why EA games on the Genesis are bigger and have this gross yellow tab. Once the mad bastards at EA actually went and did it, Sega caved and cut a licensing deal with them at the last second before the release of their first Genesis game, Populous. And then EA, you know, the guys who made Boom Blocks, they didn't bother to update the ROM for Populous before it was released in North America, so it just straight up didn't work in any Genesis made after 1991. Damn it! The TMSS was the same piece of hardware across all regions, just with different jumpers connecting to different parts of the console's memory, which meant that you could modify the console with switches instead, allowing you to easily swap between regions. That required skill with a soldering iron that was beyond the average Sega Genesis enjoyer though, so the easier solution was to use a Game Genie. This was officially licensed by Sega, so it would meet the TMSS requirements, and it stuck out of the console enough that the shape of the cartridge didn't matter, making it a quick, easy solution to region locking on the Genesis. Well, what do you know? Over on Nintendo's side, they opted to keep things pretty simple for the Super Nintendo. North American SNES games once again had a completely different design, preventing the two from intermingling. Weirdly though, Europe used the same console and cart design as Japan this time around, so if you get mugged by a North American Super Nintendo, it'll be real easy to pick it out of a lineup. But a lockout chip in the Japanese console would prevent European games from running, mainly due to the different video format used in Europe. All of that could again be bypassed with a Game Genie, despite the SNES version not being licensed by Nintendo. With the N64, Nintendo finally started using the same console and cart design across all regions. The European console had a lockout chip to lock it to European games only, once again just because of that pesky PAL format, but the Japanese and North American consoles just had these little plastic tabs in the cartridge slots that would line up with slots in the cartridge itself, which were in different places in each region. So there's a real easy way to bypass that. Yeah, it turns out it's a bit more delicate than that. With some careful application of high-powered rotary tools, you can pretty easily remove the tabs from the cartridge tray, letting you put whatever you want in there. I filled mine with chickpeas. Now, it might surprise you to hear this from someone who spent the last 7 minutes rambling about region locks, but after this point, they got so boring that even I don't really give a shit. With how simple these older consoles are, attempts at region locks were kinda like a puzzle, with clever consumers trying to figure out a way to bypass the DRM and the console makers coming up with more and more secure systems. This was technically still the case as consoles moved away from cartridges and towards CDs and DVDs, but at this point those puzzles started to move more into the realm of high-tech digital cryptography rather than fitting a square peg into a square hole. Certainly still exciting for some people, but well above the heads of most average Joes. The PS1, the PS2, Dreamcast, GameCube, Wii, Wii U, Xbox, and Xbox 360 all employed software region locks, where the console looked for a bit of code on the disc to tell it what region it was from. The PS3 could technically be region locked in the same way, but the decision to region lock was left up to the individual game publishers, and only 2 games ended up releasing with a region lock. These days, most consoles are region-free by default, letting you freely play imported physical games as well as digital if you're willing to go through the hoops of creating another account. While the practice of region locking has become controversial in recent years, back in the analog days there was a halfway decent argument for it to exist. Most analog TVs ran on one of 2 standards, NTSC or PAL. PAL TVs had a higher resolution but lower refresh rate than NTSC. The PAL standard was adopted in most of Europe, while North America and Japan used NTSC, which meant that movies and TV in one region might display with black bars or at a different speed in the other if not properly converted first. So when video games rolled around, it made sense to lock them to the regions they were made for to ensure that they would work properly. Now you might be thinking, that all makes perfect sense so far. What could possibly be controversial about making sure the games you buy will work properly with the TV standards in your region? Well, that wasn't the only reason for region locking, just the most sensible one. If you really think about it, Japan and North America both use the NTSC standard, so why go to the trouble of designing locks to prevent Japanese games from working in American consoles? The other reason for region locks was just to stop people from importing games from other regions. Back before most games received simultaneous worldwide releases, it was tempting for die-hard fans of a particular game to import it from elsewhere before the release date in their own country. With Japanese games, the language barrier would usually be enough to stop most people from bothering with importing, seeing as most Japanese games are in like French or something, I don't know. It didn't stop everyone though, especially back in the days where the average story in a video game amounted to go right. Importing was especially popular in Europe though. It wasn't uncommon for games to launch months or even years later in Europe compared to North America. So if the game you're looking for is already available across the Atlantic and in a language that you most likely understand and could be played on your console with just some minor modifications, why not ship it across the pond? The only real downside was that running NTSC games on PAL TVs often caused some visual issues and slowdown, but a lot of games weren't ported properly to PAL in the first place, so these same issues were present in the official European releases anyway. This was a problem for game publishers, not just because it reduced the number of copies available in their home countries, but also because they would often price their games differently in different regions. Depending on the cost of living and general economic prosperity in any given country, the average person may not be able to spend the equivalent of 60, 70, 80 US dollars on a new game. So in order to still have a market in those areas, publishers will adjust their pricing accordingly. Region locking is necessary for publishers to enforce regional pricing like this, otherwise one could theoretically buy up a ton of games in a country where they're cheaper and resell them in another country where they're more expensive, undercutting the original publisher. Having these region locks in place, even though they were fairly simple to bypass and only got easier with time, put up just enough of a barrier to the average person to discourage importing. And these days, the hassles of importing mostly outweigh the benefits. If you are saving any money by taking advantage of regional pricing, most of that's going to get eaten up by shipping fees. And with most games getting worldwide releases on the same day and digital TVs all running on the same standard, you just end up paying about the same price and waiting longer for the same game. Region locking still exists though. While most Switch 2s are region free, there is a cheaper version that's locked to the Japanese language only due to economic pressure in Japan. And ironically, on PC, the one platform that was traditionally always region-free, Steam has various reasons for enforcing region locks. Most of those reasons relate to compliance with local laws, but occasionally a publisher will throw out a nonsensical curveball, like Sony forcing PC users to sign up for a PlayStation Network account to play Helldivers 2, meaning they had to delist it in the roughly 177 countries where PSN isn't available. Considering this came up after they spent 3 months selling it in those regions anyway, even though they knew they were planning to make it unplayable for them, it was extra clear how unnecessary this kind of restriction was. Eventually, after some particularly loud backlash, Sony agreed and chose not to implement the PSN account requirement. For the most part, outside of a couple of the more censor-happy governments out there, video games have largely transcended international borders and become one of the world's favorite hobbies. We still get a few games that are only released in Japan, but it's a little less common these days, and it's usually easier to gain access to them from the West if you're really eager to play them. These days, the region exclusive is mostly just a fun footnote in gaming history to lock up in a cage and ogle at. Uh-oh.
Good evening, I'm Ted Bundy, no relation, with a breaking news report. An illegally imported copy of Wii Chess has escaped into the local ecosystem and is now wreaking havoc. In the absence of natural predators, Wii Chess's reproduction rate has spiraled out of control, and now roving packs of juvenile Wii Chess have been spotted, exhausting food supplies for local fauna, destroying federally protected wetlands, and shoplifting from small businesses. If you have any information about who may be irresponsible, malicious, or possibly just outright dumb enough to release such a dangerous invasive species, please let them know that they are wanted for environmental terrorism.